Collecting these sorts of records, it was inevitable really, because by the time you got to the car boot sale, most of these really hideous 40-something record deals completely cleaned out anything that was worth any money that you could make any money from, or even they'd actually cleaned out all the interesting records, and then suddenly there's this pile of Mrs. Mills records, and then behind the Mrs. Mills records there was always something that looked a bit stupid or a bit strange, and therefore it was your duty to make a purchase, I think, especially in the winter months. But I think that £1 is very little to pay for something that looked in the end to be so brilliant.
Audio, electronics, computers and magnetic tape recording have for some years been harnessed together to compose, generate and reproduce music with a complex of voices, musical phrasing and dynamic range that would be almost impossible to achieve even with a whole orchestra of conventional musical instruments. From this has emerged the electronic music maker of the future, the music synthesizer.
There's not really a sense anymore of a progress or progression, and I think the Moog record really is symbolic of the last real progression of mankind. It's the last modernist thing, modernist invention, if you like. I think the end of modernism died I think with the Moog synthesizer.
In 1964 in New York, Robert A. Moog produced his first synthesizer, especially designed for the composition of electronic music.
The synthesizer looks rather like a giant electronic organ and is a complex of electronics that can be used not only to imitate the voices of known musical instruments, but also to create some that have never existed. In other words, it can create new musical voices and sounds.
A vast range of sounds never before possible was now literally at the fingertips of every creative musician. In fact, anyone could play the Moog, especially if they had the $10,000 to $15,000 it cost to buy one. The Moog is the most musical instrument of our electronic age, an infinite variety of instruments in one. A 5-octave keyboard like that of a piano operates a system of interconnected oscillators, amplifiers, generators, filters, mixers and voltage controls, which can produce any variation of pitch, wave, frequency, overtone mixture, timbre, dynamics and tone duration. To interconnect the various modules, Moog used patch cords, leads with a jack plug at either end, which fitted into the large array of jack sockets that was linked to the keyboard to produce a sound. However, apart from the keyboard, the synthesizer hadn't got much in common with an organ. It demands a somewhat different meaning, as only one voice can be played at a time. Recordings were made using a multi-track tape recording process, enabling the performer to layer sound upon sound, rhythm on rhythm, adding new possibilities to the play of the imagination. Most of the work done on the synthesizer at this time was excellent. Although soon, though, a few people began to see the immense possibilities of the Moog in the commercial music world. Two such people were Gershon Kingsley, an American, and Jean-Jacques Perrey, a Frenchman living in New York.
Now these are crazy. I once played this, I was doing some DJing, and I put this one on, The Savers by Perrey and Kingsley, and I got chucked off straight away. Nobody could dance to it, and they asked me to leave.
It's like on one side he's merely classical, but on the other side it's like really comical and it doesn't make sense. It's like cartoon music, isn't it? It's got that really strange, it almost goes on, it's just very quick, really strange, boingy music.
Now, with a Moog synthesizer, you could make new, fantastic space-age sounds that had never before been heard. The temptation was there to use them, and use them they did. They would take these easy-listening classics and moog them up so much were totally unrecognizable. The resultant sound was something that challenged the very definition of easy listening.
I do remember a very funny story. There was a group of people had been in a car and they were going like about 100 miles or so up north, and there was one of them was arguing with another, and someone had put this tape on, and this was the in sound from way out, and there was all these barnyard animals, the Moogs going, and they were arguing with this music on the background, which made it all so comical. And so I think if you've got it and you know there's going to be an argument or something, then stick it on, because it just totally makes everything seem stupid. They were just arguing all the time, and you know, it was constant, and this tape was on, and I mean, it was just ridiculous. I mean, people were trying to stop laughing and stuff. There you are. So you know, that was, I mean, it's just a completely funny album.
This is exactly intended. After Spotlight on the Moog, Perrey and Kingsley went their own separate ways, subsequently enjoying a long solo career as a composer, arranger, and his big hit being the infamous Popcorn. Jean-Jacques Perrey went on to produce numerous solo Moog records, the most incredible being the amazing new electronic pop sound of Jean-Jacques Perrey, which included such titles as Islands in Space, Porcupine Rock, Mr. James Bond and Little Girl from Mars.
This is probably one of the best ever funky Moog records, which is EVA. And again, on this one it says, without a ship, Columbus could not have transversed the Atlantic. Without a telescope, Galileo could not have charted the solar system. And what the Moog synthesizer opens up for the future of music is beyond dreams. So, yes please, thank you very much.
The most amazing instrument is nothing without a mind behind it, and Jean-Jacques Perrey's mind is that of a combined scientist and musician, with a special love for what is happy and vital in popular music. My only purpose is to try to bring to the listener to this record some joy and pleasure. If a listener absolutely insists on seeking a message in this record, he will find one. This is nothing more than a message of humour. This is the electronics. Every day brings evidence of the incredible calculations and fantastic jobs that electronics can do. Why should it not also add to the pleasures of everyday life? The words Moog synthesizer still meant nothing to the majority of people. This changed in 1968 when the composer Walter Carlos released Switched On Bass. The album changed the way electronic music was perceived and played a part in bringing it out of the avant-garde closet into the publicness. Carlos himself was a classically trained musician, a child prodigy who had been playing since the age of 7. The meeting of Moog and Carlos was an extremely important collaboration which helped Moog produce a more expressive instrument.
Klaus sort of, in a way, tested for him and, in a sense, commented on how well things worked. Klaus also produced a demonstration record in about 1966 or 67, demonstrating the Moog synthesizer. At that time, it was more that musicians who didn't understand anything on the technical side didn't really know what was happening, and they'd never put a jack plug into a jack socket before. There were people who thought that when you had a synthesizer or later had a computer, that somehow it was magic and you only had to say what you wanted and the machine would do it all for you without you actually having to understand what the machine could do, which of course is nonsense.
Carlos would immediately understand what to do. Other musicians would freeze freak out.
Well, he basically was utilising the actual synthesizer for what it could do. He was classically trained, he was a genius of his time, and he was able to approach the Moog synthesizer and know exactly what to do, where to go to with patch chords.
My feeling at that time, after the Switched On Bach had become quite well known, was that it was no longer fashionable to say you didn't know what a synthesizer was, and that people would say, oh yes, a synthesizer, even if they hadn't really any idea what it was like.
Release of this record, Moog's name's synonymous with that of the synthesizer.
They were often called Moogs even if they weren't, just like we call vacuum cleaners Hoovers even if they're not made by Hoover.
They gave us Bach like we never heard it before, pulsating and electrifying, fun, meaning, and sometimes sheer joy. If Bach were here today, he'd heartily.
Because if it can play Bach, and if it can play Bacharach, then it's more important for it to play Bach, because then it gives it itself, the instrument and the sound, credibility that it wouldn't normally have had.
Although Switched On Bach went on to become one of the best classical albums of all time, it wasn't universally accepted in an entirely serious way. Humorous in small doses, excrude the ear for more than a few minutes.
And who saw the potential sales? Who actually saw this was like a thing to be that you could sell? It seems like the most unsaleable sounds suddenly became really saleable, really popular. Because I mean, how many millions of albums did Walter Carlos shift? That Switched On Bach sold millions, didn't it? His music can kind of carry on, and it's more acceptable in this day and age. Whereas, say, Beethoven's a bit harsh, and well, Mozart, I don't know, it's just not Moog friendly, if you know what I'm saying. Whereas Bach, it's dated very well, if you like.
In the late 60s, Carlos began hormone treatment, and in 1972 underwent a sex change operation named Wendy Carlos. She went on to produce a whole string of classical record film soundtracks utilizing the Moog synthesizer. All the big record companies wanted a Moog record of their own, but they tried to cash in on the success of Switched On Bach and flooded the US market with a tidal wave of commercial Moog records.
What happened was that everyone who bought Switched On Bach thought they could also perform like Walter Carlos. He had an incredible amount of orders for his Moog synthesizer. Around the late 60s, early 70s, we had a whole string of records that came out utilising the Moog synthesizer. Most of them Bob Moog would write off as being absolute rubbish, but he had no real way of stopping people using his synthesizer for those purposes.
Most of these records consisted of selections of cover versions. Records were released under a theme, be it a particular songwriter, for example Burt Bacharach, or a more general theme, such as country music or Christmas music. In fact, anything and everything was mooged up and sold as a record with a crazy name.
To use this machine by hook or by crook, even if it was for a token fuse, it was the in thing to have a Moog modular sounding on your record.
Virgin of virgins, be not bitter with me now. Let me mourn with you.
Now this album I do like. This is a Moog Mass. Jesus Christ, instead of having the thorns all around him, he's got microchip wires. Excellent cover. Very unusual. It has a little dialogue before each sort of track of the progress of Mary and Jesus and everything. And then it's kind of ethereal. It's got voices which are sung for, and it's very easy listening. Nice to go to sleep with at night. Unusual label, not really ever seen that one before, but there you are, a Moog Mass Cauldron.
The The sleeve notes, too, were humorous to say the least. Endless brief accounts of what the Moog and how that particular person had managed to harness its powers for their particular project. Nearly every record contained a sentence explaining how Moog, which is supposed to rhyme with vogue or rogue, is actually pronounced. The sleeve notes always referred to the Moog with a certain amount of fondness, and it became an all too common misconception that the synthesizer has a mind of its own, that it is a computer that you can plug in and it plays music, not just a machine, but a physical extension of the composer. The Moog does possess a musical soul of its own. It speaks with a strength, and it doesn't care to be in the background. Used properly, it completely overshadows everything that is going on. In fact, the Moog does nearly everything but rob banks. Perhaps the space age demanded totally new sounds. If so, the Moog provided them.
I think the sounds that were being made from synthesizers were looked upon as being very futuristic and atmospheric, and I think the link between that and space was created because of that reason.
Yeah, there is no other image that comes to mind apart from one of technology and the future. I'm not sure how that comes about. I'm not sure where that comes from, but I suppose that there is no other sound like it on Earth.
I mean, if you hear a Xiao, I mean, you naturally don't think of this Earth, do you? So it's got to be somewhere else. And so that's why I do believe that, I mean, it was the best way to sell it as well, you know, space. Everybody was into space. You know, kids in the 50s were into watching all the programs, and they couldn't have, you know, like Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon spinning around with mandolin music in the background. You know, this was the new thing, wasn't it? It was a, you know, a Moog or a computer sound, so it, you know, brought it all into fruition.
It was going to create different sounds. It wasn't supposed to be able to create violins or guitars. If someone wanted to hear a violin or guitar, then they got someone in to play a violin or guitar. He just wanted to create different sounds. It was up to the musician's imagination as to how far that was going to be taken and what it could be used for. It was a case of the one person would go into the studio, be faced with a Moog modular, and each person that did that would approach it in a different way, and the individual people would create their own sort of unique sounds which associated with how they approached the modular. I think the sounds were very much unique to the actual musician.
I think that electronic music gives these early pioneers reasons to just be themselves. They don't have to employ orchestras, they don't have to have, you know, many other musicians. All it is themselves and the technology, and I think that auteurism and that control that they had over their music creates some of the most interesting fusions of music that I've ever heard, and I think that's another reason why I really like Moog music. This one is Ananda Shankar, and he's the son of Ravi Shankar, and it's totally mad. It's absolutely brilliant, and he does a version of a Moog version on the sitar of Jumping Jack Flash, which I think is fantastic. And I'd like to note that there's this wonderful sitar, but there's also cleverly just in the foreground electronic circuit board, which is wonderful. And he says, "I have a dream to try to combine Western and Indian music into a new form, a music which has no particular name, but is melodious and touching, and which combines the modern electronic devices with the old traditional instrument, the sitar." It's perfect.
His name is Ananda. He's a young man with a sitar and a dream. He's excited about Led Zeppelin, Janis Joplin, and electronic music. A music with no name. A music bracketed by Vedic chants. and footprints of the moon. Around the late 60s, early 70s, a lot of musicians gave up their usual way of working, bought a Moog synthesizer and went electric. Most, however, only flirted briefly with the Moog, soon returning to the safety of their original instruments. One person who made the transition to Moog and back again with relative ease was Klaus Wunderlich. Klaus enjoyed commercial success in Europe in the 80s with his Hammond Pops series. In 1973, Klaus released his first Moog album, Sound 2000 Volume 1, the first in a trilogy which featured his own response to popcorn, the aptly titled Cornflakes, and the ridiculous Moog pun, Cremoogulous. Himself in the underworld with the sounds of bullets, explosions, and abstract noises. The synthesizer makes it possible electronically. Klaus knew the Moog made stupid noises and even told us so on his records. Before Klaus returned to the Hammond organ, he gave us one final Moog offering in 1974, the adventurous Oral Tidal Schnulzen synthesizer gags, which is, in his own words, a hit parade of synthesized old evergreens for which he'd like to apologize, because he didn't do the job completely with a straight face. He adds in the sleeve notes, P.S. Should you not like the record, please buy all the copies available and destroy them.
Even if at their very worst, they are still good. There isn't, you can't make a classification on them saying, well, this music is bad and this music is good. The whole point is, we've reached a stage where music like this is important and it shows us the past and it has something to offer us beyond good and bad.
He's another guy that is obsessed, which is good to be obsessed. Now, Tomita, and on the background of the, you can see him with all his equipment behind, looking very proud there, that he's got all this stuff behind him. Now, he's taken years doing these records, apparently, and if you could, just this bottom, I won't read it out, but that's all, that's just his accessories. I mean, you know, all these numbers of how many he's got of these things. I mean, this is a guy that's totally dedicated. Now, he's taken Debussy as his mentor, and all of Debussy, that Debussy's Firebird and Snowflakes Are Dancing. I mean, what he's taking the classical genre and spaced it up. And someone said to me once that listening to this record is like floating naked on a rug in space, and that's exactly what it's like.
Yes, I don't know who bought those records. I didn't sort of meet ordinary people who became fans. I bought one simply because at that time I was documenting the history of electronic music and I needed to know what was going on.
I'd love to sort of time travel back to 1973 and hang around in Woolworths by the little record section just to see, you know, who bought these Moog records and what did they look like, what homes did they actually go to, because as I can gather it, none of my friends' parents that I've talked to ever admit to buying any of these records, and I would like to meet a genuine Moog buyer at the time. Interesting.
In the absence of hard sales figures, it is difficult to tell just how many Moog records sold at the height of their popularity. The only indications we can get is the frequency which they crop up at car boot sales, jumble sales and charity shops.
I don't know if a lot of it was actually bought really, because, I mean, you know, if you go out second-handing, jumble selling and stuff like that, you don't see that many. I don't think it was taken on. I don't think the public took it on very well. You know, you could look through jumble sales for a week and not find one Moog record. I think, you know, you've got the Hammond organ thing, haven't you, and Hammond Pops and stuff like that, and that was really taken up, I think. You know, like Hammond Pop Party and and then, you know, and stuff like that.
By 75, you were coming to the end of the Moog modular era. I think that there was too many other things going on. You had too many people then wanted to use the small monophonics.
The advent of performance synthesizers led to a different type of synthesizer music. Synthesizers could now be integrated into bands and their sound became diluted.
The musicians were looking for a smaller version, which is how the Mini Moog came about. Jim Scott and Bob Moog both worked on the Mini Moog, and it turned out to be a classic machine. It had all the technology of the larger modulars, but it was condensed into a far easier understanding machine.
If you're only playing one melodic line on your big modular Moog synthesizer, you could do it equally well on a Mini Moog.
With the disappearance of the modular systems, sadly went the Moog record.
I'd like to mention one guy. He's called Michael Bundt. He's German, and he's got a record called Just Landed Cosmic Kid.
This man, he's wonderful. I found him in a charity shop in Crystal Palace, and it was just one of the smelliest, darkest charity shops I've ever been in, and he was just lurking behind a load of rubbish, and I just had to buy it because he had lipstick, really.
Now this record is just excellent, although he does do a bit of poetry on the other side, which is funny. I mean, you're embarrassed for him when you're listening to it, but it's a very good cover. And then when you open up, it's a gatefold cover, so when you open up, he's got this white suit on which is electrified, and this woman standing behind, just like the front of the Mastermind game. You know, the woman standing behind the man in the swivel chair.
These sounds are logical developments of our age, which should be part of the experiences and pleasures of daily life, including the music we use for our amusement and entertainment. First track to the last, happy sounds are generated by this miracle of modern electronics.